So, hello and welcome to another episode of the Sliding Doors podcast. For those of you that haven't joined us before, it's a look back at kind of those what if moments, those sliding door moments in life where, maybe you didn't take that opportunity. And we kind of link those to three categories. So that's kind of love and relationships, work and career. And then we always have a wild card category. And we're joined today by Amandeep. So I'm going to hand over to Amandeep now to introduce herself.
Hiya, my name's Amandeep, and I am currently in the profession of the world of HR. I sit as a ER advisor, so I sort of came from a very generalist background, worked my way up through sort of very conventional. I got into HR quite late, so I did the conventional. I don't know if I can say conventional because not everybody's had the same journey as me, but everybody I've met who I worked through was in the very similar boat that I worked my way up through HR admin and sort of did assistant and advisor, and now I'm at a regional ER advisor role. So that's where I'm in terms of my career. I've sort of got 5 years under my belt coming up to, and just really enjoying my life in the West here, really. So I'm from sort of outskirts of London, sort of North Kent, but I'm now residing over in the West, in between Bath and Bristol. So I'm absolutely loving it over here, and I have no plans on leaving because everyone's very, very friendly.
Good. So we'll kick straight into kind of our first category, and that's kind of sliding door moment around kind of relationships. So what's your sliding door moment there?
So I think really, in terms of relationships, you could go on and on in regards to relationships, but I guess probably one of the most, I was going to pick my other half and sort of talk about that. We're 12 years in, and sickeningly, he's my best friend. I love him to pieces. I wind him up, and he's just brilliant. We've really evolved together as two separate people and within our relationship. But I'm actually going to probably pick my relationship with my mother and my father, with my parents. Really, I think coming from the background that I grew up in, I'm a real millennial baby. So I'm 85, and I grew up sort of with immigrant parents, in the sense of they came over in the 60s, my grandparents, and they sort of based near just London. And I think growing up, I was very much raised in a very strict household, firm but fair, being one of 5 children and the majority of them being girls. When you've got immigrant parents from a certain culture, I'm basically was Sikh, and they're very, very religious, but also coming to a new country and having to work and uprooting your life. So I think the relationship with my parents was, very, I want to say it was very rocky, but I was a teenager, we all had rocky relationships of dealing with our hormones and life. And really growing up, I was Indian, in my blood, in my bloodline, but I've been raised as, an English person. So I don't have that. I had that separate culture with my parents they knew the Indian culture over in India in, the 70s. I was born in the 80s and have known England through and through. So I think growing up, really, it's about being in the English culture and learning the way of life here in the 80s, 90s as I'm growing up, and having that relationship with my parents and saying, I'm, for example, something silly like, I went to a Church of England mixed school, mixed sex, mixed faiths. And really my mum sort of said to me, don't go talking to boys, don't talk to these sort of people. Sometimes really the general, like, mum, you can't say that, that's really racist or really wrong, and really, a lot of that. So my sort of defining moment was sort of when my sort of dad had a heart attack and had to have a triple heart bypass surgery. And really it was that relationship that was me being embarrassed of them and saying, please don't say that, certain people do this or certain sexes can't do that, and putting those boundaries. And really it was me always fighting that resistance against my parents, and realizing that they weren't the oxes that were strong all the time. you know, they do wear down after time if you keep testing them, and they're human, and they make mistakes, and they're not perfect. They just try their best. So I think really it's about my dad becoming ill and me stepping back and going, hang on a minute, he tried his best, and really starting to reshape that relationship with him. And everything he did was for the best, even if it wasn't always in the format that I felt that it was. So really, I think they sort of shaped a lot of my opinions, and also in my career. You know, their philosophy was, if you've got a job, stick to it, you're lucky. That's what we get. And I was stuck in that mode for a long, long time, until I sort of very much came back from traveling in my late 20s and decided that I wasn't going to waste my life in, you know, one job for 6-7 years, which is what they had taught me. And I'd taken on, I got the security, but I realized that as they were trying to do their best with me, everything they taught me, I was really questioning. So really, it's sort of no to my parents to sort of say, you know, they tried their best with me, and I'm sorry I was a pain in the backside. But I do learn, and I am still learning, I think, really.
I think there's just a few things I want to pick up on there. So first of all, thanks for sharing that. I think that's a really interesting insight in terms of kind of, like I say, you don't necessarily appreciate it in terms of, you know, obviously that wasn't my experience growing up. There's a lot of similarities there in terms of you know, generationally similar generation to yourself, similar generation of parents that probably had a certain view on things kind of growing up. Certain, you know, certainly that kind of that strict but fair piece. I think that bit stuck out in terms of that was very much the same as us. I'd be interested to kind of hear what your split was. So you mentioned you're one of five. I'm also one of five. So it's interesting that I would be interested to kind of hear your split. I know you said majority girls. Is it all girls? Is it, what's your?
So we literally have 4 girls, and I'm second. And so sort of it started in the bout of girls, the girl train, we call it. The first, my oldest sister was born in 83, and then we're all 2 years apart. And then we got a little prince that came through in 1996. Eventually, when I was 11 years old, much to my dismay. At that point, I knew I'd had some form of sex education. So afterwards, I got over the disgust from my mother and father. My lovely little brother came into the world, and so we're generationally 80s babies, all the girls, and then my brother is a 90s baby. So that split was interesting growing up as well. How about you? Where have you come from?
So we're again, it's a bit of a wider split. So there's the older three, as we kind of call them in our family, are 70s babies, and then there's me and the closest, like the next one up, my closest sister. We're both 80s babies, but again, we're split in terms of she was sort of early 80s, I'm then towards the end of the 80s. So yeah, there was that real split, and like you say, that bit around a little prince coming on, that's how I was probably looked at in terms of when I arrived. And certainly that, I'm sure my eldest sister will be able to relate to that disgust that parents had gone again. So that, yeah, I find that really interesting, and I also find it really interesting, like you say, as then your parents get older. I probably had again kind of being able to relate to that in terms of my dad again had, you know, kind of health issues. It's then around ensuring that they're a bit more PC as obviously the world's kind of developed, and you know, we can't have that sort of view on things anymore, and yeah, that does put, like you say, does put a bit of a strain on the relationship, doesn't it? But I think it's just learning to kind of appreciate, like you say, they have got older, times have moved on, kind of seeing things through their eyes as much as through our own, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you know, I really think about that, because you know, when we talk about experiences, you know, if your parents grew up in another era, let's pick on era just for the sake of it, of that. You know, my father's experiences are very much closely related to race, just because he was an immigrant, and so he has got strong feelings on how we're treated as, you know, based on the color of your skin. let alone based on your class and your sex, but
Mm.
based on the color of your skin. So I'm very careful as I've got older to say to him, you know, rather than saying, Dad, you can't say that, I now understand my dad is saying this because he's gone through this experience, and it was horrendous, you know, because they sacrificed a lot for us to be where we are. So whereas now I try and say, Dad, why have you got that opinion? And he says it, and I think, okay, that's really harsh,
Mm.
but if that's your opinion, I really respect that. Going forwards, the only thing I can do is say that I can either challenge it in my experiences, or I can say I respect where you're coming from. I don't
Mm.
necessarily agree that that's how we are going forward, but I respect where you are with that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way of putting it. And then the final bit I want to touch on, and it will lead nicely, I guess, into our next category is that bit you touched on around career and the whole job for life mentality. Because I was certainly, that was kind of passed on to me, I guess, was, you know, you get to certain organizations. So for example, I worked for Marks and Spencer's when I started working there. Obviously, from my perspective, yes, they're a good employer, but from a parent's, you know, more generational approach, that they are the employer from a retail perspective, and therefore you should stay there forever. And again, I you know, did a couple of years there, realized it wasn't for me. That was probably the tipping point that kind of pushed me into HR and where I am now. So I think, yeah, it was really interesting from my perspective to kind of hear that somebody else had that as well from their parents, in terms of it's not just mine.
Absolutely. I see the difference already in terms of just the generations and what they expect, what they want from their employers, and what their aspirations are. I don't see
Mm,
this employer for life anymore. I see this as
no.
I see them saying, here are my skills. How are you going to utilize me? The different mindset is really interesting, because I
Mm,
feel as a millennial, I've got that old school, that mix of that old school link to my parents, but challenging it and trying to be progressive and trying to
mm,
work in this world that's always changing, especially with the market, the job market, and particularly in HR. What's going on with the job market there, and our skill sets and what's coming up. I'm always interested in seeing what's going on there. Even though I'm more than happy in my role, I just find
yeah.
it really interesting, you know, especially with recruitment and that sort of talent piece of what we do with your current employees
Mm,
and your workforce. So I think that I found really, really interesting. And I find it really, really interesting to look at socially as well. You know,
mm.
the different, when we do go back into the office, you know, whatever the new norm is, to see those relationships and how they develop.
Absolutely. And I think that takes us nicely onto our second category, which is all around kind of work and career. So we've already kind of touched on it, I guess, that you know, you work in HR, but what's your kind of sliding door moment there?
So I think my sliding door moment was actually in the so the lovely pandemic hit, which we all remember because we're still in the midst of it, right? But I think when we sort of went into lockdown in March, full lockdown, and it was our first experience,
Mm,
I coped quite well throughout that year. I was very lucky. I was very steady in my role. I worked from home. However, what happened was, after a year of just having to keep my mind and my life together, I was really lucky, you know. I was able to pay my mortgage, my bills. My other half was doing well in his role. We were sitting relatively pretty, actually,
mm.
in the grand scheme of things. Same storm but different boat, you know, that sort of
Yeah, that
analogy.
mentality, yeah.
Yeah, and then I think in terms of my career, what happened was I just had this moment where I wasn't gelling with the culture, and I realized that I was doing everything else right. I was following the right trajectory, but really in my soul and my personal relationships at work, it wasn't hitting the mark. And I
Mm,
think I sort of had a moment in January the year after where we were still in full lockdown. It wasn't getting any better. I felt that my mental health really hit a pothole. I didn't feel it declining.
no.
I just held on so tight that I was okay and I should be grateful. You know, my parents' mentality, you're lucky, look at somebody else down the road, or look at everybody else. They're really struggling. What are you struggling for? You shouldn't be ungrateful. But I just had to have that moment where I just not broke down, but I just let my mind sort of have a moment where I thought, why do you feel you're not good enough? Why do you feel you can't progress? Why do you feel, hopeless in the role that you're in? And I think I sort of had to really reevaluate and say, where do you want to go? You can't be stuck in a job again that, you're unhappy in. That's your responsibility to look at. So I left, handed in my notice, and I left on good terms, but I left at breaking point in my head where I just didn't take responsibility for how I was feeling. So I left a permanent role and I went into a fixed term role because I needed something different. And my other half sort of said to me, look, as long as you can bring up your half of the bills and the mortgage and stuff, and we're very equal, he will support me, but he's very real in the sense of, do what you want to do, but money does make the world go round. It's a necessary evil. So do what you want to do, but just make sure you're happy and we can keep our home and our security. So I think that was my moment, maybe two years ago, not even, where I just had that moment where I thought, I don't know what I'm doing. And, I'm sort of coming up to my late 30s, which I don't want to admit, but I am. And while I feel great in one way, I feel more comfortable in my skin than I ever have in my career. It was only 2 years ago that I felt, what am I doing? And I love being in HR, which is, I don't know if I'm the right person for it, because I'm weirdly kooky outside of work, but inside of work, I say the right things and I believe the right things. But I just need to have a culture where if you say something as an employer, you have to really believe it, because I have to put that into practice. I have to guide and I have to have those difficult conversations sometimes. And I think that's where I was at. Those 2 points weren't meeting. So in my career, sort of in January, a couple of years ago, I took that really scary leap of going into a fixed term contract. And it was the best thing I ever did, to take that chance.
And I would just, so first of all, that's from a great share from my perspective, but also a couple of things I just want to add in there, that I found myself in probably a similar position to you before, in terms of I was in a secure HR role, permanent, but it didn't fulfill me, didn't make me happy. I wasn't getting the career development. It wasn't necessarily helping me from a personal perspective. It just didn't make me happy. And again, I had probably a similar conversation with my wife around, there's this fixed term contract that's come up. I want to apply. It's better money, but it's a risk, isn't it? As we know, a fixed term contract is a risk. And this, luckily for me, this moment kind of happened pre-pandemic, if we can remember back that far. But this, so towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and it was kind of that moment where I need to do this. I need to do this for me. I need to do this to kind of make myself happy. And then lo and behold, 6 weeks later, the pandemic hits, and I'm in a fixed term role. So, immediate concern there. But luckily, that employer at the time saw that. They kind of saw the value in that. In that, we're now in a pandemic. He's taking a risk to come here. We're going to offer him the chance to go permanent. I was obviously doing a good enough job in that kind of first 6 weeks for them to consider that. I don't think it was just it's the pandemic and we're going to be nice. I think there might have been a bit of good work there alongside that. And I'll be kind of forever grateful that happened. But also, I think the bottom line is you have to bet on yourself. You have to kind of make yourself as happy as you can be, to kind of take then, like you say, that full self into your role, isn't it? In terms of, we as HR, and for those listening that aren't in HR, we probably have had a tough pandemic in terms of a lot of what people have asked has come through us in one way or another. And I don't think that's necessarily been reflected. Again, I'm not then taken away from some of the excellent work that other services have done. That's not what I'm saying. But, for a lot of organizations, HR have been kind of fundamental in delivering furlough messages or redundancies or whatever it may be. And we've had to react in a way that we never would have expected. And I
Absolutely.
just wanted to kind of circle back as well to the beginning where you kind of mentioned that you've done every role in HR is kind of where you are now. So just if you wouldn't mind just kind of talking us through that for obviously those that aren't familiar with kind of those HR structures and those HR roles, just a kind of a brief overview of where your journey's led you, I guess.
Okay. So sorry. So when I said I've done all the roles in terms of the HR generalist route, so I would say the very conventional HR admin, HR assistant, HR advisor, and then at that point, I've chosen to go into ER and get my exposure up that way. So in terms of the HR heads who do know that it's a growing field, you've got talent acquisition, you've got recruitment, you've got all sorts of growth areas. So it's just becoming, that people function. It's being rebranded. It's the people function, but HR is growing. So I've sort of worked my way up through, a very big law firm and gone in as HR admin. And why that was great is very structured. All the, for example, you go in and somebody says, we need you to start processing these letters for maternity, paternity, sickness leave, anything that needed a letter that was that admin function. There was a template there. There was a process. There was a manual. There's a great big Bible. Plonk it down in front of you. Off you go. Start churning out the letters. And that's how I learned. Very, very much old school. Sit down, read, and go through. That's when I realised that there was something in that sort of, I want to start talking to people. I'm a people person. And it's really, now I'm going to say something really controversial. I am a people person. However, when you go into a role where you are constantly people facing, or it's all about people, you begin to realise how sometimes you hate people sometimes. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to say hate because it's a very strong word, but I'm going to say it controversially because I love communicating. I love talking to people, but the difference in when you do it as a role is you don't speak to people that are always on the same level as you are. So you start to realize that you're talking to people who don't have the same views, who don't agree with you, who deliver things in a different way to you. And that's the one thing I love about HR. You learn what you'd like to do and what you definitely won't do going forward. You see that delivery in your role. So I think as a HR advisor, I really enjoyed that part. And I think that's what led me to go on to ER advisor, because I believe to push myself, I need to have difficult conversations, and I don't want to be seen as the face as every time I come into a business, because I'm an ER advisor, they think someone's in trouble here. She's only here because someone's in trouble. I want to start changing that perception of HR, and particularly ER, they're difficult conversations, but to go through that generalist route and stay broad and then start to specialize makes you realize that you've got those strengths, or you want to work on weaknesses. I think it depends how you want to go in that role. So I've worked in big law firm, big corporate sort of environment. I'm now in hospitality, but I've also worked for housing associations. I've worked for utility companies, and they've all been really big in size in terms of their employee numbers, been really flexible, but some have been really rigid. Some teams have been growing and downsizing, and that HR function, like you say, throughout the pandemic, HR has helped deliver with businesses downsizing, upsizing, changing structures. There's a lot that's gone on. And for somebody who came from admin, it's been invaluable. You learn so much. But you're right, as the non-HR heads, how you deliver, you might not see that HR should be there to guide, really. I don't believe HR should be the police, but I don't know if that's a new mindset. And, I don't want to go in and be isolated as a HR person. I want to sit with, teams, and I want to get to know people. I want to help deliver policies and help people through absences, or, anything to do with family leave or family policies. I don't want people to come to HR thinking they're going to meet resistance. I want them to come to HR to say, we're real people. This is a real life situation. Life happens. And I think that's where me going forward is where I want to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that will hopefully add, for those listening that aren't HR related, will hopefully be able to grasp that as well. Because I certainly kind of echo that in terms of, and I've I've been on a similar journey. I know we've discussed it previously, but yeah, it just, I think it is kind of key to understand that we don't just sit behind a desk and be fun police. We are involved in trying to make it better for you as well. We're not all negative. So
Absolutely. There is an element of it,
yeah.
definitely, because you can't have as much fun being in HR because you're like, that's just on the cusp. But I agree, we're not the other way
No,
either, So
no. And that takes us kind of nicely on to our third and final category. So this is the wild card, and this is all kind of over to you in terms of what's your kind of specific wild card, sliding door moment that you want to share with us.
I think, in all honesty, I sort of have this. So recently, I've just celebrated a birthday, and I've sort of, as I've gone through the years, I've realised what my sort of what makes me happy in life, and I think sort of realising that, again, it's very much linked to my career and my family, that all I want to do for this birthday, and I am really, really conscious that I'm going to sound my age now, is that, this weekend, all I've done is go to see my parents. I've eaten food. I've sat and played cards with them. So, and really, it's just having that moment where I realise my parents won't be around forever. And I don't want to be too morbid, but
No.
I'm a realist, that I want to get as many moments in with my parents. I want to get as many moments in with my nephew, with my sisters, with my brother. And really, it's to say, my parents won't be here forever. This pandemic has really made me realise that the way I utilise my time is really, really important to me. And I think I've had quite an extreme shift of mentality where I really resist a lot of things. I like to question, I like to be questioned. And I think going forward, I really questioned, was HR fulfilling for me?
Yep.
Like, I'm a real empath. I cry at everything. I cry if I see a bee in the sky, and and my other half sort of looks at me and he says, I can't believe you're in HR sometimes. How can you deliver this and this sort of stuff when you cry at everything? And I sort of said to him, I'm sick of holding in who I am as a person. I am allowed to be this person, and I am allowed to try and change the world through HR, which sounds really cheesy, because I think real life work, changing lives, is doctors, surgeons, people who go abroad and help with housing and social crisis, in other countries and in this country, and care about politics and going forwards. And I think particularly with my career and what's going on with Bojo, I'm going to call him Bojo, at the moment, I feel it's really important to stay positive,
Yeah.
but also be a realist. And, I think the key thing for me is to say what you see. For example, Boris, I'm not a fan of the Conservatives, and I never have been, but I did respect Boris because he cared about people, and he showed them in his, in his manifestos and his policies. But I'm very, very aware that, let's call a spade a spade. He's made mistakes, but he's tried his best. And without going into the politics of whether you're for or against the Tories, really, my view is, going forwards, I want to see people care, whether you're in politics or in HR. I don't want it to be about money. I don't want it to be about how big, the energy crisis and how, when I want to see solutions, I want to see people saying, we're going to go through an energy crisis. We've got, a party that we've potentially lost a lot of faith in, but how can we get better going forward? Can we forgive them? Can we forget? How can we rectify it? And I think being positive isn't about smiling all the time, even though we're going through, pardon my language, this shit show. It's about being honest and saying, he made a really bad mistake there, or I made a really bad mistake. Am I genuinely going to put my hands up and say sorry? And how can I rectify it going forward? And how can I get that faith back? I think so. Really, it's just about not being too negative and being positive, and everything ties into life. And we're not, and that mortality, of saying my parents aren't always going to be here, but how can I make sure that I spend enough time with them to get those good memories, and not be so cynical going forward. I want to be that the HR head. I want to be that person in HR in 20 years time where I can help to mentor people. I can give someone that faith in the profession and in business and being growing up in the UK, in England specifically. It's a great place to be, and life is really, really good. There's so much opportunity still. It's just I want to be that person to make sure going forward I inspire people, through honest conversations, and not feel like they've got nowhere to go or they've got no empire to build. You can do anything you want. We just have to inspire each other, I think.
Yeah, you're right, and I think you're that kind of, how do I put it? It's not morbid to start thinking about this. I think a lot of people our kind of generation start to think this. I certainly reflect on it with my dad not being here, in terms of kind of, there's things that I'll never get to tell him. There's things that he'll never get to see. I think it's something that, on reflection, I should have thought about earlier. You kind of think that they'll always be here, so I don't have to think like that. That was certainly how I thought in my 20s, and then he sadly passed away the day after I turned 30. So I didn't really have that reflection time in my 30s to say, let's build better relationships. You go through life in your 20s, and then before you know it, these things have happened, unfortunately. But you're right in terms of, just it's about recognizing that, taking the opportunity while you still can, and kind of not thinking about too much of things we can't influence. All you can influence is what you can influence, isn't it? Like you say, you want to, in 20 years time, be saying, oh, I've mentored someone, I've done something. Especially from a HR point of view, we don't tend to reinvent the wheel, we tend to keep the wheel turning, would be my analogy. But I certainly look at it in kind of, where do I want to be in 10 years, 20 years? I want to be somewhere similar. I want to be have given back, in terms of, people have given to me. I want to be in a position to kind of give something back to somebody else, and have helped someone progress to their role or whatever. So no, I fully get that. I fully get that. And I think at that point we're gonna bring the show to an end. So just thank you for your time, and
Not at
for
all.
those
Thank you for
listening,
having me.
if you can like, share, and subscribe, everyone, and we'll see you all soon. Goodbye, guys.
Great.